A miracle happened in the ICU of a hospital in Chicago at 3 a.m. A skeptical nurse saw a teenage boy standing at the bedside of a dying patient, a boy she later recognized from photos of Blessed Carlo Acutis. No one else saw him. The cameras showed nothing. But from that night on, her life was never the same. Before we continue, tell me in the comments where are you watching from and what time is it there right now. I want to see how far Carlo's light is reaching today. The ICU had its own kind of night. It wasn't like the night outside, the one that lay quiet over Chicago with its streetlights blinking against the cold. Inside the hospital, the night felt heavier, like it carried the weight of every life hanging in the balance. Machines hummed, vents sighed. Once in a while, a monitor let out a soft beep that told you something was steady, or not steady. But most of the time, it was simply the kind of stillness that settled into your bones if you worked there long enough. Sarah Mitchell knew that stillness better than she knew her own voice. 38 years old, 15 years in the ICU, and there wasn't much left in her that could be surprised. People said, experience made you wiser. In the ICU, experience mostly made you tired and taught you not to expect miracles. Her hands had saved more lives than she ever tried counting. Her eyes had seen things most folks only caught glimpses of in their worst dreams. And her heart, well, her heart had learned its lesson the hard way. Feeling things cost too much, and in the ICU, feelings could get in the way. She worked like someone who had forgotten how to live outside of shift hours. Machine steady, routine-driven. 8 hours of moving from bed to bed, chart to chart, IV to IV, with the same calm that people mistook for strength. But it wasn't strength. It was emptiness shaped into discipline. Her shift started at 11 every night and ended at 7 in the morning. And while most folks struggled with late hours, with the dark and the loneliness and the strange quiet that comes with the middle of the night, Sarah had grown to prefer it. Fewer people around, fewer questions, fewer families pacing the hallways with swollen eyes and tissues stuck in their pockets. Less noise, less emotion, less everything. She wasn't mean. She wasn't unkind. She was just hollow in a way she didn't talk about anymore. But if anyone wanted to understand what Sarah saw later that night, they'd need to go back 12 years back to a hospital room where she wasn't the nurse but the sister, Emily, 23 years old. Green eyes bright like early spring leaves, a laugh that filled a room before she even finished stepping into it. Sarah used to think Emily was the kind of person God paid extra attention to. And then she learned that sometimes the people who shine the brightest go out the fastest. The whole family prayed back then. Novenas, promises, candles burning day and night until they melted into little puddles on every flat surface in the house. And Sarah, she prayed until her voice cracked. She whispered every bargain a desperate person bargains, every impossible plea. But one March morning, Emily slipped away. Softly, quietly, like a candle flickering out. And in that moment, something in Sarah didn't just break, it turned cold in a way she hadn't known before. Not sadness, not even the kind of anger people talk about when they lose someone. It was more like a hard, dry bitterness settling in her chest, the kind that sticks and doesn't move. Right there, standing next to Emily's bed, Sarah made up her mind about one thing. All that talk about God, prayers, miracles, plans, it was nothing but empty words, noise. The kind people repeated because they didn't know what else to say. As far as Sarah was concerned, if there really was a God, he wouldn't have let Emily die the way she did. So she decided he wasn't there at all. Or if he was, he sure wasn't worth talking to. From that day on, anything religious made her skin crawl. Rosaries, prayer cards, the sound of people whispering, "Please, Lord," with their heads down. She couldn't stand any of it. It felt fake to her. But she kept her thoughts to herself, checked vitals, adjusted drips, wrote numbers on charts. And at 7 every morning, she walked to her car without lifting her eyes to the sky, because she'd stopped believing there was anyone up there to listen. But in January 2025, on a sharp, freezing night in Chicago, Sarah Mitchell was about to learn that some things she'd taken as absolute truth weren't as solid as she believed. It was a Tuesday, nothing special about it. Sarah arrived at the hospital at 10:45 p.m., 15 minutes early, same as every shift. She changed in the locker room, tied her hair back in a quick knot, checked her phone out of habit. 2 messages from her mother lit up the screen. She didn't open them. She couldn't handle anything that required more emotional space than she had to give. By midnight, the ICU had settled into that thick, late-night quiet. 6 patients, 4 stable, 2 critical. Bed 4, 70-year-old woman recovering from heart surgery, stable. Bed 6, 52-year-old man with pneumonia, improving. Bed 8, 16-year-old girl from a car crash, critical but responsive, a fighter. Then there was Bed 3. Robert Patterson, 62, 5 days in a deep coma, prognosis unclear, family steady as stone. Sarah never had anything against the man himself. He was unconscious, a body fighting to stay alive. What bothered her was what surrounded his bed, the blue rosary always looped over the headboard, the whispered prayers, the murmured Hail Marys, the wife and 2 grown daughters who prayed like prayer itself was a kind of lifeline wrapped around their hands. Every time Sarah passed Bed 3, something unpleasant twisted low in her chest. Not anger, not exactly, more like an old bruise being pressed again and again. His wife always thanked her. Said things like, "God bless you, nurse," and "We're praying for you too." Sarah simply nodded and walked away, polite, professional, and very far from believing any of those blessings had a destination. That Tuesday, visiting hours ended at 9, but Sarah let the family stay until 10, not out of kindness. Arguing took more energy than she felt like using. 1 a.m. passed, then 2, then 2:30. Everything stayed predictable, which was the best anyone could hope for on a night shift. She made her rounds the way she always did, bed to bed, chart to chart, adjusting blankets, checking the lines, listening to the soft hiss of ventilators. By 3:15 a.m., Sarah was back at the computer station, typing in numbers she didn't need to look at twice. The routine was so drilled into her she sometimes wondered if she could do it with her eyes closed and still get it right. Beep. Bed 3. Not unusual. Probably another adjustment needed. She grabbed the clipboard, stood up, and headed down the corridor. The ICU hallway carried a kind of blue tint from the low lights. Machines hummed. The temperature was cool and steady, just the way it had to be. Everything familiar. She pushed aside the curtain around Bed 3 and stepped inside. And froze. She didn't know what was wrong at first. It wasn't the machines. They were all there, blinking, beeping in rhythm. It wasn't Robert. He lay the same way he had for 5 days. Still, pale, eyes closed. It was the air. She took a breath and felt it before she even identified it. Something warm, something dense, something alive. Then the scent hit her. Roses. Not the powdered kind old ladies wore to church. Not the artificial smell of a candle. This was fresh, strong, like someone had just walked in from a garden with snow still on their coat, carrying a bouquet of roses so real you could picture the dew still clinging to the petals. Sarah blinked, confused. There were no flowers in the ICU. There were no flowers allowed anywhere near the ICU. It was a rule hammered into every nurse's head from day one. She looked around. No vases, no wrappers, nothing on the floor, nothing tucked behind machines, nothing in the vents. But the smell was there, clear as breath, and Sarah wasn't the kind of woman who hallucinated scents just because she was tired. Her hands shook slightly as she adjusted Robert's medication. She finished the task quicker than usual, backed away from the bed, and stepped out from behind the curtain with her heart thumping in a way that felt too close to memory. At the station, she tried focusing on the computer again, but the scent clung to her mind no matter how much she tried pushing it away. Roses, in the dead of winter, in a sealed-off ICU. It didn't make sense. She told herself it was fatigue, 15 years of nights, her mind mixing things up. Anyone could get confused when they lived in the half-lit hours between midnight and sunrise, but deep down, she knew what she felt, and she couldn't explain it. The rest of the shift passed quietly, too quietly. She left at 7 as usual, changed out of her scrubs, walked out through the cold parking lot, and drove home with the radio off. But all through the drive, the scent seemed to follow her, as if it had soaked into her hair, her clothes, her thoughts. When she returned the next evening, the new shift started the same as always. Routine checks, medications, notes. Robert remained in the same condition. No change, no improvement, no decline. Just the same coma holding him somewhere between this world and whatever lay beyond it. Margaret had been there during the day, the blue rosary hanging from the headboard like always. Sarah didn't look at it, but she knew exactly where it was. Her eyes always found it, even when she tried pretending otherwise. 3:15 a.m. Another alarm from bed 3. Not a soft beep this time. Not a simple adjustment alert. The urgent one. Sarah ran. Robert's vitals were dropping fast, blood pressure sinking, heart rate jumping in uneven, dangerous bursts. Damn it, Sarah muttered under her breath, reaching for emergency meds and moving automatically through the motions she knew by muscle memory. She was adjusting the IV drip when she felt it again. That presence. It wasn't sound. It wasn't movement. It wasn't anything she could name. It was like a shift in the air, a warmth at her back, a sense that someone had stepped into the room though she hadn't heard a single footstep. Her hand froze mid-air. For a second, she couldn't breathe. Every instinct she had, every rational, grounded, ICU-hardened instinct, told her she didn't want to turn around. Because if she turned, and whatever she felt was real, then everything she had spent 12 years burying would break open. She took in a breath that trembled, turned, and standing across the bed, right there on the other side of Robert's still body, was a boy, a teenager, maybe 15 or 16. He wore a dark hoodie, plain jeans, and white sneakers that looked too clean for a hospital. His hands were relaxed at his sides. His face was young, soft, but not childish. And around him, barely there, but unmistakable, was a light. Not the glow of a machine or a reflection from the monitor, but something warm, golden, like sunlight late in the day. Faint, but real. Sarah didn't move. Couldn't. He wasn't supposed to be there. She knew every patient, every visitor, every staff member on the floor. And this boy, he wasn't one of them. The light around him was faint but steady, soft and golden, like the last bit of sun through a kitchen window late in the afternoon. It didn't flash or glow the way light from a monitor or a reflection might. It hovered gently, like it belonged to him. Her body didn't move. Couldn't. Her eyes fixed on him, and everything else in the room fell away. His skin was light, his features delicate, with dark, curling hair brushing the top of his brow. But it was his eyes, brown, bright, and somehow deep beyond his years, that locked her in place. There was peace in them. Not the kind people talked about in greeting cards or prayers, but the kind Sarah didn't believe existed anymore. The kind that made her chest tighten, not from fear, but from something older, something buried. And his smile, soft, calm, not wide or showy, just enough to say, "It's okay, you're not alone." She didn't recognize him right away. He wasn't a visitor, wasn't hospital staff. And he wasn't from the Patterson family either. She knew every face that had stood by Robert's bed over the past 5 days. This boy didn't belong here. But then, somewhere in her memory, something stirred. Not a fact, not a name, just a familiarity. Like seeing someone you've only ever known through photographs. And then she remembered. The rosary. The picture in the wallet of that elderly woman from 2 years ago, Mrs. Delgado. The young man smiling beside a chalice, with dark hair and that same calm expression. The same face in the framed photo brought by a priest to pray over a cancer patient in bed 9 last year. The same boy her own mother had once mentioned quietly, reverently, late one evening when they still spoke often. A saint, she'd said, or almost a saint. Carlo, a modern-day kid who made websites about miracles and died too young. Carlo Acutis, Sarah murmured without realizing she'd spoken aloud. The boy didn't flinch. He didn't confirm or deny. He simply stood there, looking at her with those eyes full of something she couldn't define. Compassion, maybe. Understanding. A softness she hadn't been looked at with in a long time. He didn't speak. Not a single word. But he didn't need to. Because right then, as if in slow motion, he placed his right hand gently over his own chest, over his heart, and then slowly raised that hand, open-palmed, toward Robert. The moment his hand lifted, the air in the room shifted. Sarah felt it in her skin first. The cool, sterile air of the ICU turned warmer, thicker somehow, like a blanket had been wrapped around the walls. She could feel it humming quietly, not noise exactly, but presence. And then came the scent. Roses. But not like before, not faint, not questionable. This time it hit full, like a wave washing through the entire room. Sweet, fresh, clean, unmistakable. It filled her lungs and made her knees weak. Roses in January. In a room with no windows, no flowers, no way for that smell to be here at all. Still, there it was. She didn't move. She didn't speak, not because she was afraid, but because she knew deep down, somehow if she interrupted, she'd break something sacred. Her eyes shifted to the monitors. The screen that had been blinking red a moment ago began to change. The heart rate, once skipping and struggling, found rhythm, steady, measured. Blood pressure numbers, dropping moments before, began to climb, slowly but surely. Oxygen levels stabilized. The bright red alerts on the monitor turned yellow, then green. And for the first time in days, Robert Patterson's body looked peaceful. Not just maintained, not just medically supported, but peaceful. Sarah felt tears gather in her eyes, hot and unwanted. Her throat tightened. It wasn't the change in vitals alone. She'd seen people bounce back before. Machines could be wrong, stats could shift, but this was different. She wasn't doing anything. No medication had been adjusted, no code called, no crash cart pushed into the room. She was just standing there, watching a boy who shouldn't exist, heal a man who should have been dying. Carlo's light grew warmer, golden now, like the air around him was being lit from within. It wasn't harsh or bright, it was soft, comforting. The kind of light you'd want to walk toward if everything around you had gone dark. And then, into that silence, Sarah heard a voice. But not in the room, not in her ears. It was inside her. Not loud, not booming, just clear and steady. You are not the one to blame. It's time to forgive yourself. The words didn't just settle in her mind, they sank all the way through her, cutting past the years and the layers and the shields she'd built. They hit something buried so deep she hadn't touched it in a dozen years. Emily. She saw her. Just for a second. Not as a memory, but like a flicker behind her eyes. Emily in the hospital bed. Emily's hands. Emily's voice. Gone too soon. And her own hands, gripping the metal rail of that bed, praying until her throat went raw, making bargains she knew couldn't be kept, feeling something shatter inside when the machines went still. Sarah had carried that moment every day since, like a weight in her chest, like rust in her joints. She hadn't prayed since, hadn't believed, hadn't let herself feel much of anything, because it was easier to numb it all out than to let any of it break her again. But now, standing here, in this impossible moment, with this impossible boy, hearing that voice inside her, the wall she'd built began to crack. She didn't sob, didn't collapse, but her eyes filled. Her breath hitched. Her hands trembled as she reached for the chart that no longer mattered, because there was no note she could write to explain what was happening. She looked back at Carlo. He hadn't moved. His hand still hovered in the air between his heart and Robert's chest, but something in his posture eased, like a signal had passed from one soul to another, and he knew it had been received. Then he looked at her again. This time, it was more than just peace in his eyes. It was recognition, like he saw her. Not just the uniform, not just the nurse, but the person she used to be, and the person still buried under all that silence. Sarah tried to speak. Nothing came out. She thought she might say, "Thank you," or ask how, or why, or something, but her throat closed. Maybe it was awe, maybe it was shock, maybe it was years of disbelief all burning off at once. Carlo tilted his head gently. Not a nod, not a bow, just acknowledgement. Then the light around him softened again, like the end of a sunset, and the scent of roses started to fade, not gone, just thinner, lighter, like it was drifting somewhere else. Sarah blinked, and he was gone. No movement, no sound, just an empty space where he had stood, as if the room had breathed and exhaled and carried him off with it. The machines kept humming, the green lights stayed steady. Robert's breathing evened out, and Sarah stood there, still gripping the chart, still trying to wrap her mind around the fact that whatever had just happened, it hadn't been a hallucination, or a dream, or some cruel trick her mind had played on her after too many years on the night shift. She could still smell the faint trace of roses in the air, even though it was fading. She could still feel the warmth around her skin. And more than anything, she could still hear that voice echoing from somewhere deep inside her, not from the room, not from the hallway, but from some part of herself that had long been locked away. You are not the one to blame. It's time to forgive yourself. She couldn't breathe right. It wasn't fear, not exactly. It was something worse than fear, something older. Her heart kicked in her chest like it was trying to push back a tide that had been rising for years. Before she knew what she was doing, she'd left the room, left the chart on the desk, didn't speak to anyone, didn't check the next bed. She walked fast down the corridor. The sound of her shoes on the floor, rubber on linoleum, was the only noise she could register. That, and her own ragged breath. She pushed into the staff restroom, locked the door behind her, leaned against the cold tile wall, and finally let it come. The sob broke out of her chest so fast, it startled even her. It wasn't a polite, soft kind of crying. It wasn't controlled. It wasn't the kind you can cover with a tissue or quiet down with deep breaths. This was the kind of crying that came from too many years of holding things back. The kind that sounded more like pain than grief. The kind that bent your whole body forward, like your chest was trying to tear itself open. 12 years. 12 long years without a tear. 12 years of going through the motions, putting on scrubs, saving other people, ignoring prayers, ignoring hope, telling herself that believing in anything was a waste of time because believing once had left her shattered. And then tonight, out of nowhere, that voice, that moment, that boy, Carlo. She remembered the way he looked at her, not judging, not warning, just seeing her, really seeing her. And somehow, forgiving her without saying a word. And that broke something loose inside her, something she hadn't touched since the morning Emily died. Her sister had been the only bright light in her world, especially after their dad passed. Emily was laughter in the kitchen, music humming through the bathroom door, prayers whispered before meals even when nobody else joined in. She was joy, pure, uncomplicated joy. And then came that march, the hospital room. The machines, the slow decline. Sarah had begged. She had dropped to her knees in a hospital hallway at 3 a.m., with her hands clasped and her face wet from crying, whispering every kind of deal she could think of. She promised God her own life in exchange. She promised to never ask for anything again. She'd given him every offer a desperate person can make. And nothing came back. Emily died just after sunrise. Sarah hadn't been the same since. She hadn't prayed, hadn't lit a candle, hadn't walked into a church, and she'd shut out every patient, every visitor, every co-worker who dared to speak the name of God like he was still someone who could be trusted. She thought she'd buried all that. But now, in the staff bathroom, with her face buried in her hands, she realized she hadn't buried it. She'd just let it rot inside her. And tonight somehow that rot had cracked open, and instead of anger, something else had come out. Not peace exactly, but a start. A little after Femme, Sarah wiped her face, cleaned up, and stepped out. Her eyes were red, but she didn't care. The ICU was quiet. A few nurses passed her in the hallway, and she nodded at them out of habit. Nobody asked anything. Nobody seemed to notice the change in her. By 6:30, her shift was over. But she didn't go home right away. Instead, she took a left turn into the basement hallway, where the security office sat behind a thick window and an old metal door. "Hey, Jim," she said to the guy behind the counter. He was pouring coffee into a styrofoam cup, clearly halfway to clocking out himself. "Morning, Sarah. You need footage again?" he asked, tired but polite. She nodded. "From ICU, room 3. Timestamp around 3:15. Jim raised an eyebrow but didn't say much, just pulled up the logs and clicked through the feed. Within seconds, he had the camera angle from the ceiling corner of Robert Patterson's room. Same angle it had always had. Wide, high, clinical. He hit play. And there it was. Sarah entering the room, walking to the bed, standing still, adjusting the monitor, standing again, then turning and leaving, alone. There was no boy. No movement across the bed. No Carlo. No light. No roses. "Looks like it was just you in there," Jim said, not unkindly. Sarah didn't say anything for a moment. She stared at the screen, watched herself freeze in place for a good 30 seconds, staring at nothing. But she knew better. "Oh," she finally said. "Okay, thanks, Jim." He gave her a nod. "Everything all right?" Sarah smiled, not wide, but real. Getting there. She left without another word. Whatever happened in that room hadn't been caught on camera, and somehow, that made it feel even more real, like it hadn't been for anyone else, just her. The next morning, Sarah woke up later than usual. She hadn't slept long, but it was deeper sleep than she'd had in months. No noise, no stress dreams, just quiet. By noon, she was sitting on her couch in sweatpants, holding her phone, staring at the text message she'd ignored 2 days earlier. "Hope you're well, honey. Call when you can. Love you. Mom." She didn't think long. She grabbed her keys, pulled on a jacket, and drove. It had been months since she'd been to her mother's house. Maybe longer. She could never seem to handle the quiet of that place. Or the way her mother still kept Emily's picture up on the wall like it hadn't been over a decade. But today, none of that scared her the way it used to. When her mother opened the door, she blinked in surprise. "Sarah?" Sarah nodded, suddenly unsure why she hadn't come sooner. They didn't say much at first, just hugged, not the quick kind, a long, warm one, the kind that made the years feel less heavy. They sat at the kitchen table, just like they always used to, a pot of tea between them, a plate of crackers they didn't eat, and Sarah talked. Not everything, not all at once, but enough. She told her mom about the boy, about the light, about Robert's recovery, about the voice, about how it all felt like it reached somewhere inside her she thought was dead. Her mom didn't interrupt, didn't question it. When Sarah finished, her mother took her hand. "I believe you," she said softly, "and I think Emily would be very happy to know you finally opened your heart again." Sarah couldn't say anything. Her throat was tight, but she nodded. They didn't cry much. Not this time. The grief had changed shape. By that night, back at her own place, Sarah pulled out a photo album from under the coffee table, something she hadn't done in years. She flipped slowly, past family vacations, Christmas mornings, old birthdays, and there was Emily. Smiling, always smiling. But for the first time, Sarah didn't feel like someone had punched a hole in her chest. The ache was still there, but softer, like a scar instead of an open wound. The next morning, Sarah walked into the ICU a little earlier than usual, not out of habit. The doctor on duty that morning, Patel, came by to check in. She glanced over Robert's vitals and gave a low whistle. "Looks like we dodged a bullet," she said. Sarah didn't answer. She just nodded and walked away slowly, her hands in the pockets of her scrubs, her heart still tangled up in something she couldn't name. By mid-morning, the results from Robert's latest labs came in, and that's when things got stranger. White blood cell count, which had been dangerously low, was back in range, and not just barely, but well within the healthy zone. Platelets had stabilized. Signs of infection? Gone. As if whatever had been attacking his system had vanished overnight. It didn't make sense. Not medically. Not by any book Sarah had studied. By the time the doctors rounded later that day, Robert's condition had moved from critical to stable. By the second day, he was off all antibiotics. By the third, he opened his eyes. Margaret was at his bedside when it happened. The nurse on shift later told Sarah that Margaret dropped to her knees and wept like she hadn't cried in years. Her 2 daughters came running down the hallway a few minutes later, both of them holding onto each other and praying out loud as they entered the room. Sarah didn't go in right away. She stood just outside the curtain, listened, watched, and tried to hold herself together. She could feel it again, the warmth in the air, the shift in energy, like the space around that bed still remembered what had happened. By the 4th day, Robert was alert, talking, laughing a little, asking about what happened. That's when Dr. Ramirez, the attending physician, made his statement. "I can't explain this," he said during rounds, looking straight at Sarah. "None of us can. This man shouldn't be sitting up right now. This kind of recovery doesn't happen overnight, especially not in a case like his." Everyone in the room knew what he meant, even if nobody said the word out loud. Miracle. That was the word people started using in the halls. Nurses whispered it at the stations. Patients' families asked about the man in bed 3. Some even peeked through the curtain, as if trying to catch a glimpse of someone who had touched the other side and come back. One of the janitors, a quiet man named Tony who always worked the overnight shift, said it under his breath when passing Sarah by the coffee machine. "He's one of the chosen," Tony said, tapping his chest twice with 2 fingers. "You don't walk out of something like that unless the Lord still needs you." Sarah didn't answer. But she didn't disagree either. When discharge day came, Robert sat in a wheelchair by the exit doors, bundled up in a knit sweater someone had brought from home. Margaret stood behind him, her hands on his shoulders, tears still running quietly down her cheeks. Sarah came by to say goodbye. Margaret grabbed both her hands and held them tight. "Thank you," she whispered, "for staying with him, for not giving up." Sarah didn't know how to explain that it wasn't her doing, so she just said, "I'm glad he's okay." Margaret pulled her in for a quick hug before the orderly wheeled Robert away. As they turned the corner toward the elevators, Sarah caught one last glimpse of the blue rosary still hanging from the back of Margaret's purse. She didn't roll her eyes like she might have once. She didn't feel anger or dismissal. She just looked at it and felt a quiet sense of peace. She hadn't been alone in that room. Not that night. And she knew it. 5 weeks passed. Winter in Chicago stayed stubborn and sharp, the kind of cold that crept into your bones even when the sun was out. Snow dusted the sidewalks. Wind snapped at scarves and cuffs. People rushed from cars to buildings like the air itself might bite them. Sarah went about her days. Same scrubs. Same hours. Same machines humming in the background. But something was different now. Not on the outside, no one would have known. She still checked vitals, still adjusted medications, still kept her charts neat. But inside, something had shifted. It wasn't a full-blown conversion. She didn't run back to church or start praying before every meal. But she noticed things she used to tune out. Like the old woman in bed too, who prayed the rosary every morning and offered a quiet blessing to every nurse who came in. Sarah didn't avoid her room anymore. Or the way sunlight came through the high windows just after 7 a.m., landing right across the foot of bed 6. She had seen it every morning for years, but now she actually looked. And when someone whispered, "Thank you, God," near her, she didn't flinch. She didn't mock it silently in her head. She just let it be. About a week later, Robert came back. Not as a patient. As a visitor. He walked down the ICU hallway with his wife at his side. His step was slow but steady. He had color in his cheeks, and his voice, though softer than before, had a strength behind it. He made a point to greet every nurse who had cared for him, shaking hands, asking questions, saying thank you more than once. When he got to Sarah, he paused. They hadn't spoken since his discharge. He hadn't been awake when it all happened, at least not in the way she had been. But he looked her straight in the eye and said, "I remember." Sarah blinked. "You remember?" "Not all of it," he said, "but enough." They sat in the empty break room for a few minutes while Margaret chatted with another nurse down the hall. Robert spoke slowly, like someone choosing every word carefully. He told her that when everything went dark, he didn't feel pain, didn't feel fear. He felt light, warmth. A golden hallway, he said, like a tunnel but not quite. More open, soft light all around, gentle, kind. He saw a boy, a teenager, dark hoodie, gentle face, smiling. "I wasn't scared," Robert said. "He just looked at me like he knew me, like he'd been waiting." Sarah didn't speak. Her fingers curled tightly around the edge of her coffee cup. Robert continued. He wasn't glowing, not like in movies or stained glass windows, but there was something about him. That light, it was all around him, but it didn't shine on anything. It came from him, like he carried it. Sarah said nothing. She sat still, her hand still clenched around her coffee cup, thumb tracing the edge of the lid like it might keep her grounded. "I knew who he was," Robert said, voice low. "Not right away, but then I remembered. His name. We prayed to him sometimes. My wife, especially. And the kids. They'd read about him online. Saw a video once. Carlo Acutis. He said the name like someone saying it for the first time out loud." Sarah looked up slowly. "You're sure?" "I've never been more sure about anything," he said. He didn't speak like someone trying to impress, or dramatize, or make a point. He spoke like someone recalling something they didn't fully understand but knew was real. He didn't use words. Not exactly. I didn't hear him, but I felt him, like a message coming through, not from outside, but from inside. It wasn't loud, it wasn't even urgent, but it settled in me like it had always been there, just waiting for the right time to surface. He paused, searching Sarah's face. And the words were clear. "In the Eucharist there is life." That's what he said, or gave me somehow. Sarah swallowed. She felt her throat tighten, not from emotion but from recognition. "That's what I heard too," she said finally. Her voice was nearly a whisper. Not out loud, inside, like it had been waiting for me too. "We are those." Robert sat back in the chair across from her, both hands resting on his knees. "He looked at me," Robert said, and then behind him this door opened. Not a door like in a building, just a space, filled with light. But it wasn't blinding, it was beautiful. It felt like home, even though I've never seen anything like it before. Sarah was completely still. And just when I started to walk toward it, he raised his hand. Not forceful, just gentle. He shook his head, and I knew. I wasn't supposed to go. Not yet. He looked down at his hands, then slowly back up. And that's when he said it. "Not yet. They still need you." Then the light faded, and I felt myself falling. Not a drop, more like being pulled back. Then I opened my eyes, and there you were. Sarah didn't know what to say. Everything he said mirrored what she had seen. The hoodie, the light, the scent of roses, the hand over the heart, the calm, the warmth, the way the world had shifted for just a moment. But it was that last part, the voice, that struck her the hardest. The words had come to her too. Not the same ones, but close, personal, healing. "You are not the one to blame." They had both been spoken to. They had both been seen. Sarah leaned back slightly in her chair. Her spine touched the cool metal, and she let out a long, steady breath. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't carrying the weight of a memory alone. They sat in silence for a minute or two. No need to say anything else. It had happened. To both of them. And it wasn't meant to be explained. Just remembered. And honored. The weeks that followed passed gently. Sarah returned to her shifts. The machines still beeped. The hallways still held the same quiet chill. The long nights still stretched out between 11 p.m. and 7 a.m. Just like they always had. But Sarah wasn't the same. She wasn't softer, exactly. She didn't suddenly become talkative or warm or change the way she walked down the hall. But something in her had let go. She no longer flinched when patients prayed aloud. She no longer felt her stomach knot when someone pulled a rosary from their pocket or whispered the name of a saint or asked for God's mercy. She didn't need to believe in the same way they did, but she no longer carried the old bitterness, the sharp edge that had cut so many moments short before they had a chance to matter. And more importantly, she no longer felt the anger that had followed her like a shadow for 12 years. She didn't need a scientific explanation for what had happened that night. She didn't need to prove it. She didn't tell anyone either. Not even her mother. Not again. Not because it was a secret, but because it was sacred. And sacred things, Sarah had learned, didn't always belong in the bright light of small talk and second-hand retelling. It was something between her and Carlo, between her and Robert, and, maybe, between her and the sister she still missed every day. Emily hadn't come back, but something had. Something Sarah had thought she'd buried with her. The part of her heart that still believed in healing not through medicine but through grace. She thought about that night often, not every day, but often enough that she would find herself pausing at Robert's old room, remembering how the air had changed, how the scent of roses had filled the space, how her hands had stopped mid-motion, not from fear, but from awe. Robert, now fully recovered, had kept in touch. Not often, just a note here and there, a phone call once a month, an email to say he and Margaret were doing well. He never told others about his near-death moment, not in full, but she could tell, in the quiet way he spoke, that it had shaped him just as deeply. He had started spending more time with his grandkids, volunteering at church, helping with food drives. Nothing dramatic, nothing flashy, just steady, grounded, changed. And Sarah? Sarah had started walking again. Not power walks, not exercise, just walking. Evenings, after her shifts, around her neighborhood, sometimes near the lake when the weather allowed it. She no longer avoided silence. She welcomed it. She even started to look at the sky again, something she hadn't done in over a decade. The blue above her didn't make her feel abandoned anymore. It felt open, wide, possible. And on the first Sunday of spring, when the wind had finally lost its bite and the tulips in her neighbor's yard were starting to break the soil, she did something small but meaningful. She walked into a flower shop on the corner, bought a single rose. Not a bouquet, not a gift, Just one. She held it the whole way back to her car, sat for a moment behind the wheel, and stared at the soft pink petals. It didn't smell like that night. Not exactly. But it was close enough to remember. That afternoon, she returned to the hospital not for a shift, not to visit a patient, but just to stand for a moment outside the ICU. She held the rose in her hand, not low, not hidden, just gently out in front of her, like something worth remembering. No one asked why she was there. No one needed to. She stood there, eyes on the familiar hallway, where machines beeped and lives flickered between loss and survival every day, and she let herself feel it. Not grief, not guilt, but peace. For the first time in 12 years, she wasn't running from the past. She was walking forward with it, whole. Still healing, yes, but whole.